Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to the 14th lecture in this series. I'm very pleased to announce tonight that this series is now being sponsored by the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, BICL to its friends. And I'm very grateful for their support and generosity. And you'll be hearing from Spiros Maniatis, the director of BICL, after the lecture. Now, as many of you know, many of you I can see have been to this lecture many times before, I'd like to announce that tonight is a first. I've been able to do this for the last 13 times, and I'm very pleased to be able to do it again tonight. Please may be the wrong word in the context of what I'm about to say. It's easy to achieve a first tonight, as this will be the first lecture ever delivered virtually. Our lecturer, Jan Paulsen, is in Bahrain. I am at Hong Kong International Arbitration Center with a number of friends and colleagues, and at least over 300 people have signed in for this lecture. So we have 381 people from 50 jurisdictions listening to this lecture. So that is indeed a first. Tonight's lecturer has been the driving force in international arbitration for 40 years at least. His name is synonymous with innovation and thought-provoking books, papers, and speeches. He's been an advocate in some of the most important cases and has sat as an arbitrator in both commercial and treaty cases, as well as having appeared before the ICJ. It's been my privilege to have him appear before me as counsel in an arbitration, and we've sat together in some fascinating cases. I can't begin to set out all his achievements, save to say that he was president of ICA, and it was during his term as president that ICA was completely revamped into the modern membership organization that it is today. Now, his latest book is entitled The Unruly Notion of Abuse of Rights. And I'm very pleased to say that Cambridge University Press is offering a discount, a substantial discount, to all attendees at this lecture, whether virtual or in person. And if anybody wants to know more about that, Karen Tan at HKIAC will give them all the details. The intriguing subject tonight is omnipotent fantasies. We're all in the dark and we're all waiting to be enlightened as to what this is about. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Jan Paulsen to deliver this lecture tonight. Over to you, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am honored and happy to be with you. I am honored to give the Kaplan lecture this year. Neil Kaplan is a good friend and somebody I admire as a consummate professional. And I'm happy because this is the first time I participate in a virtual event, which is only hybrid and has a live audience which I can see. And I thank the organizers for having added that wrinkle. It makes a difference, a touch of the normal in these strange times. And it's stimulating to actually see listeners here. Omnipotence Fantasies. James Thurber was a beloved American humorist. The best known of his short stories, published in 1939, was The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. The protagonist of the story was an inconsequential man living an uneventful life. He compensated by daydreaming about his imaginary exploits as a famous surgeon who succeeds in miraculous operations, as a fighter pilot of unmatched daring and success, as an intrepid spy who saves this country, and so forth. I expect that many of us are from time to time gripped by omnipotence fantasies. They are probably quite revealing about us. I'd like to know about yours, but I suppose you'll only reveal them if I tell you my own. And that will not happen. This lecture is concerned about how arbitrators decide international disputes. I trust we can take this as a starting point. Arbitrators are expected, unless explicitly given greater authority, to operate within the constraints of applicable law. They are not omnipotent. The expression palm tree justice is pejorative. One dictionary definition of palm tree justice speaks of it as an approach to justice that is entirely discretionary and transcends legal rights or precedent. It will not do in our ecosystem. Too bad for the Walter Mitty who might be lurking in the dreams of international arbitrators. But I have a strong suspicion that those who dispensed justice in this fashion in ancient times were in fact obeyed more often because they had power, not because they were wise. And when praises were sung to them on account of their wisdom, this was less often because of sincere trust than because it seemed suitable to flatter them. My remarks today will not be a general disquisition on omnipotence fantasies, but rather a reflection of a specific manifestation of this disorder. I'm talking about the abuse of catchphrases like legitimate expectations and proportionality, as though they were rules of decision, sufficient to establish whether a claim of legal entitlement is or is not well-founded. Ladies and gentlemen, they are not sufficient. In 1905, the incomparable American judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, wrote this in his famous dissent in a case called Lochner versus New York. General principles do not decide concrete cases. I've often thought of that observation and was therefore riveted when I came upon one of Holmes's published letters to his friend Harold Lasky, where 15 years after Lochner versus New York, Holmes wrote that in deliberations with his fellow US Supreme Court justices, he would say flat out that no case can be settled by general propositions. I will admit any general proposition you like and decide the case either way. So if we remain at this level of generality, we may as well stay under the palm tree. But parties to international arbitration do not accept absolute arbitral power. Decisions that pretend to be commanded by the invocation of such general propositions will be castigated as arbitrary. I have selected a single general proposition to make my demonstration, namely the supposed prohibition of abuse of right. Now, everyone favors respect for legitimate expectations and proportionality. Everyone condemns the abuse of right, but this does not get us anywhere. The words themselves presume a conclusion, and that is useless. No one favors abuse. No one favors unkindness. But is there a legal rule that we must be kind? When a contract has been affected by the increased cost of raw materials, is it okay to declare that the plaintiff is unkind or is abusing his right because he is seeking the benefit of a contract under which the other party will lose money? Are we back under the palm tree? I have put pen to paper and written the little book, which has just come out, mentioned by Neil Kaplan. Its title again is The Unruly Notion of Abuse of Right. You would be spot on if the adjective unruly strikes you as an echo of the hoary case of Richardson versus Mellish, where an English judge in 1824 observed that public policy is like an unruly horse, which if you decide to jump on it, might head off in unimaginable and unwanted directions and thus lead you, in his words, away from sound law. International arbitrators, of course, frequently apply national law, and some national laws more or less authoritatively recognize a principle which they refer to as abuse of right, or, depending on the language, misuse of the law. It may therefore become necessary to come to a more granular understanding of what is meant by the corresponding words under the specific national law in question, informed by practice, case law, commentary, and the like. Good luck with that. My book will not help you. In fact, to the contrary, chapter 3 is called A Cacophony of Criteria, and it distills no less than 34 formulations found in national laws that try to give specificity to the notion, a particular version of the notion. Their inconsistencies cannot be reconciled into a single coherent rule. It makes me think of a massive pileup of automobiles, drunken drivers at the wheel having speeded recklessly on a crowded highway, which has just been covered by black ice. One category of formulations focuses on detriment to the defendant. It is said that conduct constitutes an abusive right if its sole purpose is to cause harm, a subjective criterion, or its sole possible effect is causing injury to another, an objective criterion. Or yet again, if its only effect is to cause harm to another without benefit to the owner, or if it is done maliciously so as to injure others without reference to other purposes, or if its preponderant purpose is to cause harm, another subjective criterion, or if it causes more harm to others than benefit to oneself, I suppose an objective criterion, or if it causes an injury to another which cannot be justified by a legitimate consideration of its own advantage. Have you had enough? Or are you jubilant, thinking that whatever you wish to decide can be supported by picking a convenient expression? But what then is the general principle? Another set of formulations focuses on disregard of the supposed purposes of the right. The right is said to be abused if exercised for a purpose other than that for which it is granted. This notion, too, is expressed in a variety of irreconcilable ways. And it leads us into consideration of how one determines the purposes of a rule, about which entire books have been written, and different legal systems have different approaches. How do we interpret the legislative intent of the vast and diverse international flora of constitutions, acts of parliament, determinations of regulatory agencies, contracts, indeed international treaties, if armed only with the word purpose and an implicit invitation to use our intuition? How can one then appraise the acceptability of abuse of rights as a general principle of law at the international level? Given the heterogeneity of national laws, one can hardly begin with a presumption in its favor. So we go, as we must, to Article 38(1) of the Statute of the ICJ, which defines 4 sources of international law. It is in the third category, in order, descending order, that we find general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. Obviously, there is no place for principles of law found randomly under some national laws. The pedigree needs to be established by something far more serious than the familiarity of stray expressions. States, jealous of their sovereignty, tend to resist claims that they must obey rules made without their consent. This may explain why general principles is very much a poor cousin as a source of international law. Defendant states tend to say, "Show me a treaty we have signed." And judges applying international law prefer to base their decisions precisely on treaties, lest their legitimacy be questioned politically. Professor Alain Pellet, who has probably appeared before the ICJ more frequently as an advocate than anyone else and knows what he is talking about, reached the following interesting conclusion in his 116-page essay entirely devoted to Article 38 in the massive Oxford commentary on the ICJ statute. This is what he wrote. The court itself has referred to Article 38(1)(c) with an extreme parsimony. If the present author is not mistaken, this provision has been expressly mentioned only 4 times in the entire case law of the court since 1922. And each time it has been ruled out for one reason or another. Pellet observes that the principles of Article 38(1)(c) provide general guidelines. Guidelines are hardly rules of decision. This explains, I think, the extreme parsimony showed once more a couple of years ago when the ICJ in the Bolivia versus Chile case declined to apply the notion of legitimate expectations as a basis for its decision. My little book endeavors to be analytical with relevant invocations of authority. This presentation will take the form of a narrative with a significant human element. I will speak of 6 individuals. The attempt to seek recognition for this notion of abuse of right as an international principle was unrelated to the civil law of private transactions. This is a problem because Article 38(1)(c) says what it says, and the identification of principles recognized by civil nations can hardly proceed if one ignores fundamental rules of civil law, since national laws do not regulate interstate rights and obligations and therefore do not contain legal principles purporting to govern them. And the proponents of this attempt were in fact seeking nothing less than a revolutionary reconceptualization of sovereignty. You see, the atrocious and ultimately meaningless suffering of World War I convinced 2 prominent scholars that states had forfeited their claims to absolute sovereignty, and that henceforth international law should overrule sovereign action when sovereign rights are abused. The writings on our subject of these 2 men, Politis and Lauterpacht, starting in 1925, are extensively quoted in every study of abuse of rights I have read. It is sometimes forgotten that their noble enterprise failed. A third well-known scholar, Schwarzenberger, represents the backlash that became perceptible in the late 1940s. I choose him because he was the most adamant in his denunciation of the Politis-Lauterpacht approach. He had a young acolyte named Bin Cheng, who is perhaps known to most of you as the author in 1953 of a genuine bestseller, namely The General Principles of Law as Applied by International Courts and Tribunals. Some careless readers may think that he recognized the prohibition of abuse of rights in his chapter on good faith. If so, he would have been repudiating Schwarzenberger. He was not, as I will be able to show you. Next, I will introduce you to 2 brilliant young scholars from Central Europe, the first having come to London from Switzerland to study with Bin Cheng, and the second a refugee from Hungary, who was to enjoy a long and illustrious university career in France. The Swiss writer, you may well think, put the nail in the coffin of the idea of promoting the notion of abuse of right. The Hungarian, for his part, wrote a prize-winning thesis, which to this day remains a work quoted as often on this subject as Politis and Lauterpacht. His thesis was in effect a retrenchment, giving up the idea of a freestanding rule regarding abuse of right and leaving us, in my view, where we are and where we should remain. So here is a story. Nicolas Politis had studied in France and been appointed a law professor there. He became Greece's foreign minister in 1916 and represented Greece in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Profoundly marked not only by the horrors of World War I, but also by the devastating consequences of the Greco-Turkish War, Politis was instrumental in the creation of the Hague Academy of International Law. The title of his famous lectures, published in 1925, displays a subtitle in much, much smaller letters. This plainly is indicative of his priority and is worth reproducing for you to see on a screen. A simple photocopy of the front cover of his 1925 book. In large letters, the problem of the limitations of sovereignty, and then much smaller, and the theory of abus de droit in international relations. Make no mistake, Politis was not seeking to establish the existence of a legal proposition, but to promote the political objective of neutralizing the excesses of state sovereignty. He suggested that the theory of abus de droit might be used as a means to that end. These were his radical words. La souveraineté doit être réservée au droit et pour plus tard à la communauté internationale. Elle ne peut plus appartenir aux États. I translate. Sovereignty should be reserved for the law and in due course for the international community. It can no longer belong to states. Looking back 3 decades later, the skeptical professor Georg Schwarzenberger addressed the Grotius Society in London on the topic uses and abuses of the abuse of rights in international law. His first words were to refer to Politis's famous course of lectures, as he put it. But he continued, "It did not take long before what Politis had modestly termed a theory, and what might still be more preferable to call a hypothesis, was described in a somewhat bewildering tempo, first as a doctrine and then a principle of international law." We'll come back to Schwarzenberger. Hirsch Lauterpacht is frequently associated with Politis as the second prominent proponent of bestowing normative international effect on the concept of abuse of right. And he had the advantage of writing in English. A giant in the field of international law, Lauterpacht rose to great distinction as an academic and as a judge and president of the International Court of Justice. One of his early works, The Function of International Law in the International Community, 1933, contains a chapter entitled "The Doctrine of Abuse of Rights as an Instrument of Change." It commences with this sentence: "Although as yet unknown in textbooks of international law, the doctrine of abuse of right has recently attracted the attention of international lawyers." This passage ends with a footnote in which Politis is the dominant reference. Like Politis, Lauterpacht was not seeking to elucidate the concept of abuse of right, but to enlist the theory, as the very title of his chapter revealed, as an instrument of change. "There is an abuse of right," he wrote in the first paragraph, I'm quoting still, "each time the general interest of the community is injuriously affected as the result of the sacrifice of an important social or individual interest to a less important, though hitherto legally recognized, individual right." The audaciousness of the claim that legally recognized rights should be displaced whenever they consist of a less important individual right of single states that might harm the general interests of the community becomes clear when one considers who should make that determination, as to which Lauterpacht's answer was clear: judges. There can be no doubt that this constituted a broad attack on the conventional notion that international law was inapt to deal with non-justiciable issues with respect to which state sovereignty could not be questioned. His goal may have been lofty, it surely was, but Lauterpacht's attempt in the remaining pages of this chapter to find support in positive law for abuse of right as such an instrument of change was, at least in my view, unimpressive. I cannot go into them here. You can judge for yourselves in this famous book. Lauterpacht was transparent about his search for, I quote, "a lever of progress." He concluded, "The law of nature has been rightly exposed to the charge of vagueness and arbitrariness, but the uncertainty of higher law is preferable to the arbitrariness and insolence of naked force." Politis and Lauterpacht were thus raising a call to arms to change international law in a profound way. The plain fact is that the international community of states failed to show much eagerness to accept the suggested expansion of adjudicatory authority. The attempt thus faltered in two stages. First came the simple recognition that the project could not generate a consensus in its favor. Realists thereafter retreated to a more modest strategy, namely to promote the objective of curtailing excessive claims of right as a policy objective by promoting specific treaty commitments having that effect. A very different objective than seeking acceptance of a general commanding principle. Responding to Lauterpacht's thesis that the indeterminateness of higher law is preferable to the arbitrariness of the insolence of naked power, Schwarzenberger, who was Lauterpacht's academic adversary in more ways than one, was harsh. In a Harvard Law Review article in 1946, he unmistakably had Lauterpacht in mind when he railed against those who appear to pick and choose from natural and positive law exactly as they think fit, deciding with an air of infallibility what God and reason ordained, and state practice is usually more honored by neglect than by systematic study. What he called ipse dixitism had, he wrote, become rampant in the treatment of international law. Specifically with respect to the notion of abuse of rights, no less a figure than Gerald Fitzmaurice affirmed that the doctrine cannot be regarded as definitively established or as constituting an accepted principle of international law. Brierly's classic textbook, The Law of Nations, the 6th edition of which was edited by Humphrey Waldock in 1963, did not even mention the expression. Schwarzenberger, of course, agreed with Fitzmaurice, indeed sarcastically so. This is what he said. Why engage in painstaking research work if the desired result can be attained by way of asserting that the prohibition of abuse of rights is a general principle of law recognized by civilized nations? One may well assume that the notion has exercised a formative influence on the creation of actual rules of law. This would hardly constitute evidence that such an evolutionary principle behind the law was a positive regulative principle and an overriding principle in the bargain. Time is too short to reprise Schwarzenberger's lengthy demonstration. I will mention only this observation of his, which I find compelling. It's very short. When the principle of sovereignty is excluded or limited by other rules of international law, this hypothesis of abuse of right is redundant. This brings us to 1953 and the appearance of Bing Sheng's famous book on general principles, which to this day remains available in print. It is not in essence a conceptual work, but rather a distillation of cases in order to identify a number of general principles applied by international adjudicatory bodies. Schwarzenberger was Cheng's mentor. It was Schwarzenberger who suggested the subject, supervised the study, wrote the foreword. Abuse of rights is indeed there, but only referred to as a theory in a subtitle of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Good Faith in the Exercise of Rights. The two notions are neither synonyms nor mirror images. The good faith performance of contract is known, it seems, to all systems of law, although under a great variety of terms. The Germans require conduct nach Trau und Glaube, and the English speak of implied terms. The famous Article 1134 of the Napoleonic Civil Code, copied all over Latin America and Francophone Africa, requires that contracts doivent être exécutés de bonne foi, should be performed in good faith. This means, notably, as Article 1135 makes clear, that contracts require not only the performance of explicitly defined obligations, but also what is called for by equity, usage, or law. Abus de droit is nowhere to be seen. When the French speak of abusive clauses in reference to Article 1135, they condemn things like unusual, if not illegal, limitation of liability clauses. In other words, the point is to secure enforcement of contractual duties, not to identify claims of contractual rights as abusive. Non-French lawyers often refer to abuse of rights in French. They say abus de droit, perhaps seeking to add ostensible weight to their argument on the footing that the concept has been embraced in French law. But that is not so. One of the great expositors of the French Civil Code, Marcel Planiol, famously wrote this: right ends where the abuse commences, and there can be no abusive use of any right, since the same act cannot at once be in conformity with and contrary to the law. He added that if I use my right, my act is licit, and when it is illicit, it is because I exceeded my right and act without right. Of course, this has never stopped French lawyers from clamoring about abuse as a rhetorical flourish. But even insistent proposals to include the prohibition of abus de droit in the Code Civil were rejected by the French Parliament at the turn of the century 120 years ago, and failed again 70 years ago in the middle of the 20th. Established general principles have solid foundations in the major national legal systems of law. How otherwise could they be deemed of general applicability in the international community? Abuse of right, on the other hand, is wholly unfamiliar to common lawyers, who have difficulty understanding how a right can be abused. Either a party has a right or not. If it engages in abusive conduct, it should be unable to establish the right. To reach this sensible result, alternative expressions such as unclean hands, bad faith, waiver, or unconscionable bargains may well be used if they are supported by the evidence. I'm unaware of any clamors for the common law to fill a supposed void by adopting the concept of abusive right. In sum, the status of the theory or doctrine of abusive right as a general principle seems dubious as at the outset. The young Swiss scholar, the then young Swiss scholar I refer to, whose name is Jean-David Roulet, writing in French in 1958, as it were on the heels of Cheng and fully familiar with his book, published an entire monograph on La théorie of abusive right in international law. His very title indicated considerable skepticism. Le caractère artificiel de la théorie de l'abus de droit en droit international public. His conclusion was a clear rejection of abusive right as a principle of international law. These are, in my translation, the concluding words of his monograph. By reason of the primitive and often imprecise character of the rules of international law, the theory of abusive right, which is already characterized by considerable elasticity and imprecision, loses all utility in the context of international law. To remedy imprecision by a new imprecision cannot lead to positive results. It is important to observe that Cheng, who had supervised Roulet's work in London, as Schwarzenberger had supervised Cheng's, did not reject Roulet's thesis. To the contrary, he wrote an admiring foreword to the book in which he explicitly declined to take a position as to the place of the theory of abusive rights in international law. Now, if the French Parliament was unimpressed by entreaties to incorporate abus de droit in the civil code, and indeed no foundation can be laid for it as the expression of a grand and coherent consensus of national laws, how could we imagine that it blossomed sui generis on the international stage? Bin Cheng himself, as it must be emphasized at every turn to ensure that the wrong conclusion is not drawn from the fact that the passages relating to abusive right appear in a book entitled General Principles, never endorsed the notion even as a principle, let alone as a rule of decision. There is, to the contrary, every reason to believe that he shared his mentor Schwarzenberger's doubts, if not his vehemence, in his Grotius speech, where Schwarzenberger had complained that the reasoning of actual decisions of international courts and tribunals hardly bears out the hypothesis of a prohibition of abuse of rights, and that any true answer must depend on more painstaking forms of inductive research. Schwarzenberger's earlier Harvard article was precisely entitled The Inductive Approach to International Law. In that substantial essay, he excoriated what he called the eclectic approach to international law, whose practitioners, I quote again, appear to pick and choose from natural and positive law exactly as they see fit. He sought to call away from the dreamland of deductive speculation. Now, it's notable that the very first page of Cheng's work begins with this declaration. The present work is an attempt to apply the inductive method. And that sentence referred to Schwarzenberger's Harvard article. And the nail in the coffin, as to Cheng's position, is the one I've already mentioned. Cheng's own elogious preface to Roulet's book-length rejection of abusive rights as a general principle. Ladies and gentlemen, the international community of states has never embraced the radical instrumentalist vision of abusive rights advanced by Politis and Lauterpacht. Idealistic scholarly writings do not count for much when contradicted by the reality of state practice. To be fair, I repeat, both Politis and Lauterpacht were prudent in the characterization of the concept of abusive right and did not declare its prohibition to be a principle. This was left to their followers. But by the 1950s, faced with failure to secure this status, more realistic voices came to the fore. The realists lowered their aim to that of a more modest goal, to promote the notion of abuse of right as a consideration that might inspire even exclusively self-interested states to make voluntary accommodations, in particular by treaty, in consideration of similar accommodations by other states. This is something we know as lex specialis. Unfortunately, these realists created considerable confusion because of their continued use of the expression abuse of right, even though they were not proposing an autonomous rule of decision, but rather a way of describing the effect of the kinds of international agreements they sought to encourage. The realistic move crystallized, inter alia, but with particular clarity, in a book written by Alexandre Kiss, and in 5 words written by Suzanne Bastide in 1953. Kiss had emigrated from Hungary to France in 1947 at the age of 22, and 6 years later published L'abus de droit en droit international, one of the most important studies of the subject, read and cited by all scholars who have paid sustained attention to the topic. This was Kiss's doctoral thesis, recognized immediately as a work of exceptional merit and published at the initiative of the jurors of his thesis defense by the French Centre National de Recherche Scientifique. Suzanne Bastide, a formidable presence among French scholars, and later to become the first woman to sit on the International Court of Justice as an ad hoc judge in Libya versus Tunisia, had taken the young scholar under her wings and supervised his thesis. In her glowing preface to his book, Bastide could not resist pointing out that the attempt to incorporate the notion of abus de droit into the international context revealed that the expression, and here come the 5 words which give the game away, should not be taken literally. Given that in this environment, the search for principles have a different aim, namely to promote, to underlie explicit restrictions on the exercise of state authority. Kiss himself harbored no illusions. He used terms that Schwarzenberger would have applauded. I quote, "Until now, the literature of international law has concerned itself more with deduction than demonstration, and the number of cases examined from this point of view is highly limited. In truth, the point of view, de lege ferenda, has so far taken precedence over the study of precedents." He referred to, I quote again, "the difficulty which we shall face at every step. Is the position taken by a government contrary to a rule of international law, or is it to be rejected only because we deem it to be an abuse of right?" What then to do? Kiss's answer was to explain how states might see the advantage of avoiding abusive conduct by other states, and therefore find it tolerable themselves to accept limitations on their own authority. For this, of course, one needs no notion of abuse of rights as an autonomous general principle, since the idea is to achieve the goal by negotiating treaties at the highest level of the normative hierarchy of Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice. It would require no such principle even if one existed. And that is why Bastide said, "Do not take it literally." She was impressed enough by one of Kiss's examples of how this might work that she referred to it in her preface, namely the authority given by the states who had formed the then new European Coal and Steel Union. In so doing, they'd also created a new court of justice, a court of justice which the member states gave power to sanction abusive power and conduct causing, quote, "fundamental and persistent harm to the economy of another state." Even private enterprises would have standing to seize the court if affected by harmful state conduct. Kiss himself, for his part, gave detailed and fascinating accounts of how the sovereign states of the United States and the sovereign cantons of the Swiss Confederation could be ordered to conduct themselves as riparians so as not to harm their sovereign neighbors. But of course, all this presumes prior agreement. In the instances just cited, taking the solid forms of constitutions of a permanent and existential nature, that give plenary authority to a federal Supreme Court. From the perspective of the 1950s, the sovereign relations among such confederated states or among West European states were immensely different from the relations among the sovereign states of the first, second, and third worlds. And our present world community still does not resemble Switzerland. The world community remains a different universe than that of private citizens of a single comprehensive legal system, testing the limits of rights bestowed upon such private persons by sovereign. In the world community, we are considering the self-imposed restrictions on sovereigns. Such restrictions, the self-imposed restrictions on sovereigns, may not evolve fast enough to satisfy us in a fragmented international environment where the community and the system are only aspirational. But it is what we have, and it works only in this modest and painstaking way, by the way of lex specialis. In light of this intellectual history, ladies and gentlemen, what does one call arbitrators who purport to justify their decisions by invoking nothing but the simple words abuse of right? Well, that's where I started. Walter Mitty. I thank you for your attention.
Well, Jan, thank you very much for that indeed. That was very stimulating. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Right.
Professor Jan Possen, please forgive me for not being able to resist the temptation of thanking you in person tonight. I wish to take this opportunity to tell you that I have taken the liberty to share your seminal article titled International Arbitration is Not Arbitration with many mainland Chinese senior judges and many Chinese lawyers over the years who I have encountered over the years. And you will be pleased to know, I believe, that in 2018, for example, over 540,000 arbitration cases were handled by more than 200 arbitration commissions in mainland China alone. And my question to you tonight, again, please forgive my ignorance on this topic, how do you relate the notion of abuse of right with the notion of abuse of process and bad faith? Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for those kind words and for the question. The expression abuse of process does not, except in the most artificial sense, involve the misuse of any rights. And it is indeed the source of some incoherence. There is no reason to say that a party that makes an oppressive demand for documents of the other side is engaging in abuse of the process of discovery. The rejection of oppressive demands is an inherent limitation of a procedural opportunity and does not require the sterile intellectual circularity of being called an abuse of right of access to documents that would have been provided if the request had not been oppressive. In other words, the notion of abuse of process is its own category. Another way of looking at it is to say that when we come before a court or a tribunal that has jurisdiction, one of the things that we consider that is inherent in that jurisdiction is to understand what is acceptable and not acceptable as a matter of process. That is the profession of the adjudicators, as opposed to the myriad factual circumstances of complex interrelations of states and private parties that may or may not be said to constitute abusive conduct. I hope that is of some help. I think it's an entirely different category.
Any more questions from the audience? Any questions online? No. Right. Right. Then I will hand over to Professor Maniatis to say a few words and to thank Jan personally.
This is a great honor for the British Institute of International and Comparative Law to become a sponsor, a co-sponsor of the annual Kaplan lecture. It is also delightful that we inaugurate this engagement with such a powerful lecture that probably could become the starting point for a series of lectures that will become a part of the Kaplan series in Hong Kong. The Kaplan lecture is one of the highlights of the international arbitration calendar. It is a tribute to Neil, who has influenced the development of arbitration in so many ways himself, but it is also a tribute to all those great speakers that have been joining Neil in Hong Kong. And they've been doing that in truly innovative ways, in truly provoking and thoughtful ways, rather than seeing the lecture as an opportunity for a lovely trip to Hong Kong. Although I must confess that I will miss the dinner tonight, and I do hope that there will be an opportunity next year to visit Hong Kong. And I hope that Jan will join us. Neil, you owe us a dinner. Hopefully next year. Now, Jan's lecture was truly exceptional. You agree or disagree, it was truly exceptional. It touches with such clarity the core of the relationship between international law and arbitration at a time when I think all of us are almost aching, crying for some sort of normalcy and stability. At a time where he talked about dreamland, at a time where we were living probably through a nightmare land rather than a dreamland. And it is the clarity, the intellectual clarity that is brilliant, because it is the starting point for a huge debate. At the Institute, we have been considering these questions from a slightly different angle. We have been looking at how you try to resolve disputes, taking into account public interest at a time of crisis, or hopefully post-crisis. How do you take into account the interest, if you like, of protecting cross-border supply chains? We have come up with the breathing space concepts and an attempt to introduce some voluntary guidelines that parties to a dispute can adopt, adding to the polyphony or cacophony that Jan has mentioned. The project has been presented during the Hong Kong Arbitration Week. And another project that we are developing, and it's interesting that you talked about abuse of process, looks at procedural innovation. And we hope that we'll be able to launch that project very early in 2021 from Asia. Now, to avoid abuse of time, what I would like to do is thank everyone at Hong Kong International Arbitration Center for managing this hybrid event so successfully. Everything appears to be seamless, and it is a great pleasure, if you like, to be able to address not only a Zoom audience, but a real audience. I'm grateful to the Arbitration Center. I'm grateful to Neil that we started this collaboration. Finding speakers for next year will be a huge pleasure. Part of the intellectual pleasure is trying to find the right speaker for the lecture. And I'm grateful to Jan for, this was truly exceptional, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you all.